There is nothing more iconically English than a medieval parish church set in parkland beside an old manor house. Country estates have, since time immemorial, shaped and reshaped the English rural landscape. I am at Fawsley in Northamptonshire, where there is really nothing here except for the hall and the medieval church dedicated to St Mary. From 1416 until 1938, this hall and the surrounding estate were the property of the Knightley family. It was their family seat. The house is a Tudor house added to and rebuilt by successive generations of this family. In 1938, the estate passed to the Knightley's descendants, the Gage family, who already had a large house, Firle Place in Sussex, and so the house fell into decline. Fawsley Hall, like many country houses, was requisitioned for military use in the First and Second World Wars and fell into further neglect, and it seemed at one point that it might be lost, like so many English country houses. But the Gage family sold the hall in 1975, keeping the estate, and it was then restored and opened as a country house and spa. The church is seemingly marooned in the parkland of the house, midway between the hall and a series of large lakes. There was, however, once a bustling village here, clustered around these two buildings. The village even extended beyond the church to the east and under where the lakes now stand. In the medieval and early Tudor period, the hall was set in a much smaller park within that village context, but as the Knightleys grew wealthier in the late 16th century and wanted more privacy, the park was extended and absorbed the old village site. Over a period of time, houses for people were gradually replaced with grazing for cattle and sheep. The lakes, called the Canal and the Big Water, were created in the 1760s by the fashionable landscape gardener Lancelot Capability Brown. He was called in by Lucy Knightley Esquire, who was, like many of his generations, a member of Parliament and very wealthy. When the antiquary Horace Walpole, a friend of Mr Knightley's, visited in 1763, he found Capability Brown laying out and making a large piece of water. It is likely that the last vestiges of the old village were swept away at this time to give Mr Knightley sweeping vistas from his house, with new estate houses constructed for workers out of Mr Knightley's line of sight. Churches were often used by Capability Brown and other exponents of the naturalistic landscape movement as visual features and points of interest in their gardens, and Brown carefully crafted the landscape at Fawsley to give a vista of the church from the house. To avoid cattle and sheep encroaching on the churchyard, it was surrounded by a ditch and sunken wall called a ha-ha that did the job, but didn't visually interrupt the view, as a wall or a fence might do. Brown carefully placed plantations of trees around the lakes and the park that both framed this view and gave interest to the landscape. Such landscapes seem entirely naturalistic to us now and quintessentially English, but if you were able to fly a drone over this site in the 1560s, you would have seen here a bustling village around its church, and in the 1760s you would have seen an army of navvies at work, industriously digging out the lakes by hand and crafting the landscape to Brown's vision. Churches with a close connection to an estate are often full of very interesting things, and St Mary's Fawsley is no exception. The Knightleys have left their mark all over this church, which is full of monuments to them, a full sequence of monuments from the early Tudor to the Regency period. The church interior has a wonderfully timeless, unspoilt and textured feel to it, primarily as it managed to avoid a major restoration in the 19th century. The earliest fabric we see in this church are the two north and south arcades, which date from the early 13th century. The west tower appears to be 14th century, and the clerestory, the upper windows that light the nave, are early 16th century and from a period when the church was reconstructed by the Knightleys. The church has very simple furnishings. There are 3 blocks of what are termed box pews in the nave, a characteristic form of Georgian seating, pews with doors that are designed to protect the congregation within from cold draughts. The largest of these is in the south aisle of the church and was the pew of the Knightley family themselves. It was positioned so that they could see the pulpit and they could be seen by their tenants and neighbours. The most prominent monument in the church commemorates Sir Richard Knightley, who died in 1534. There are colourful effigies on top of the tomb of both Sir Richard and his wife Jane Skennard. Jane, the heiress of her father Henry Skennard of Alderton in Northamptonshire, brought land and properties to the Knightley family. This impressive monument was commissioned from a talented young monumental mason called Richard Parker of Burton-on-Trent. He worked almost exclusively in alabaster, quarried at Chellaston in Derbyshire, close to the River Trent. The effigies of Sir Richard and Dame Jane are life-size. He is dressed in full armour, with a heraldic surcoat or tabard over the top of it with his coat of arms, and she is in a heraldic mantle with hers. He demonstrates his loyalty to the Tudor regime through the livery collar of S's that is worn around his neck, which has a pendant Tudor rose hanging from it. The tomb chest has a series of figures of their children in alabaster on the sides. 4 daughters are depicted on the north side and 8 of their sons on the south. Sir Richard's son and heir, also called Richard, is shown to the far left. He's a miniature version of his father, in armour, with again a collar of S's around his neck. The other sons are depicted in civilian dress or in clerical garb. 2 of them were evidently priests or monks. And the last pair of sons, perhaps young boys and twins, are shown sweetly holding hands. On the short end of the tomb chest is a full achievement of arms of Sir Richard and Dame Jane. Now you'll notice from this that the shield of arms is divided into 2 halves. The left half relates to Sir Richard and the right half to Dame Jane. In heraldic language, such a coat of arms is referred to as an impaled coat of arms. We have here Knightley impaling Skennard. Then the 2 halves are further subdivided, you'll notice, into segments. Looking at Sir Richard's half on the left, this is divided into 4 segments. The part that relates to the Knightley family directly is only the top left segment, for the other 3 segments are the coats of arms of families whose heiresses had married into the Knightley family. Such an achievement of arms expresses the social and material success of the family. Through both purchase, but primarily through inheritance from heiresses, Sir Richard not only owned the manor of Fawsley, but 40 other manors in Northamptonshire. Everything about this monument is designed to express stability, a pride in the past, and hope in the future. Sir Richard's long lineage is emphasised through the heraldry, and his succession through the images of his many children. Sir Richard specified in his will that he should be buried in the chancel before the image of Our Blessed Lady. The medieval chancel was entirely rebuilt in 1690, and I suspect that this glorious monument was moved to its present location at the east end of the south nave arcade at that time. Now set into the floor of the nave of the church are 2 monumental brasses, flat slabs with brass inlays that commemorate sons of Sir Richard and Dame Jane. At the very west end of the church is the brass of their second son, Thomas Knightley, who died in 1516. He is shown dressed in full armour with a heraldic surcoat bearing the coat of arms of his father. And around him are 4 shields also with his father's arms. Above him, issuing from a heart, are scrolls with inscriptions in Latin taken from the Book of Job, that were commonly used in the Middle Ages to express the Christian hope of resurrection. I believe that my Redeemer liveth, and that in the last day I shall rise from the earth, and in my flesh shall see God my Saviour. The eldest son of Richard and Jane, also called Richard, died 4 years after his father without having any children to succeed him, and so the estate then went to his brother, the 3rd son, Edmund Knightley, who died in 1542. His brass is in the nave floor beside the tomb of his parents. In 1520, Edmund had married a member of one of the wealthiest noble families in England. His wife, Ursula Vere, was the widow of George Windsor and the sister of the 14th Earl of Oxford. Like many a younger son of a gentry family not expected to inherit the property, Edmund was established in a useful profession, and he had a career in law. A very useful profession indeed when you needed conveyancing done. Edmund served as a sergeant in law and was the Attorney General of the Duchy of Lancaster during his career. He was also involved as a commissioner in the dissolution of the monasteries. Now, the gentry greatly benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries, and Edmund acquired much monastic land. The wealth that Sir Edmund created was ploughed into his house, and he rebuilt it on a grand scale. It might be surprising that, despite benefiting from the dissolution of the monasteries, the inscription on Edmund's brass expresses a conventional Catholic piety. Edmund and Ursula would have 6 daughters, all of whom are portrayed and individually named on the brass. However, the family estates were entailed, and they couldn't pass through the female line unless there was no living male Knightleys. And so, after Edmund's death, the estate passed to his younger brother, Sir Valentine Knightley. And in the north aisle of the church is a large monument that commemorates 3 generations of the family: the aforesaid Sir Valentine, who died in 1566, and his son, Sir Richard, who died in 1615, and his son, Valentine, who died in 1618. Both Sir Richard and Valentine, his son, were staunch Puritan Protestants. The monument, which appears to have been erected by Sir Richard, is a bizarre late Elizabethan or Jacobean classical piece. At the top, under a pediment with flaming urns flanking it, is a humongous classical sarcophagus supported on caryatids, with puttee nonchalantly sitting on the top. In the centre below is a tiny little effigy, and below that is inscribed, "Dust thou art, and to dust thou shalt return." Again, juxtaposed with the memento mori, reminding one of the futility of all things, are brightly painted shields of arms, recalling the lineage of all the deceased. The whole thing is a bit wacky. Also rather wacky are the 2 matching monuments on either side of this that commemorate Devereux Knightley, who died in 1681, and his widow Elizabeth, who died in 1715. His and her matching flaming urns on classical bases. Very refined they are too. Many of the late 17th and early 18th century Knightleys are commemorated by a series of Baroque tablets in the chancel, all made of white marble. The one of Richard Knightley, dating from 1728 and erected by his son Sir Lucy Knightley, is particularly fine, and was produced by the firm headed by Francis Smith of Warwick. At the bottom of it is a panel depicting arms, armour and other trophies of war. As well as the monuments, there are some interesting fragments of old glass in the church too. There are a large number of beautiful roundels. These are all continental, mostly Netherlandish, and were collected by the Knightleys in the 19th century. This 16th century roundel depicts St Catherine with her sword and the Catherine wheel behind her. Another depicts Mary Magdalene pouring oil on the feet of Christ and wiping it with her hair. In the east window of the north aisle is a collection of glass that includes mid-16th century armorial bearings of the Knightleys, but among these are 4 late 16th century armorial panels that only came to Fawsley in the early 19th century. These bear the shields of arms of members of the Washington family, the ancestors of American President George Washington. They were originally part of the glazing of Sulgrave Manor, not very far from Fawsley, which was the Washingtons' ancestral home. Although the Knightleys are long gone, they have left an abiding impression of their presence in this place through the church, the monuments and its decoration. Who could ever forget that they were the people who shaped Fawsley and its landscape? Thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.